Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing through the steamy jungles of the past into the heart of ancient Maya cities. Fair warning, you probably won't survive if you try this at home or if a jaguar spots you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where and when you're tuning in from down below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air hangs heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming orchids you can't quite see, and something ancient, something like old stone and time itself. You can feel the humidity clinging to your skin, a constant companion in this green, breathing world. You're walking, or perhaps gliding, through the emerald labyrinth of the Petén rainforest, maybe somewhere that feels like the legendary Tikal in Guatemala, or the equally evocative Palenque, nestled in the Chiapas highlands of Mexico. The path beneath your feet is soft, a mixture of leaf litter and the ghosts of ancient causeways, known as Sakbiob, that once pulsed with life. Sunlight, when it manages to pierce the dense canopy, arrives in dappled patches, illuminating a world of colossal trees with buttress roots sprawling like petrified giants. The sounds are a symphony, a constant, low thrum of insect life, the distant, guttural roar of a howler monkey staking its claim, and the rustle of, well, you try not to think too much about what's rustling in the undergrowth. It's probably just a very, very large spider, or perhaps a small, enthusiastic tour group that got separated from their guide, who promised them authentic, off-the-beaten-path experiences. You know the type, and then, through a parting in the relentless green, you see it stone, impossibly old, impossibly grand. A pyramid, its weathered limestone steps ascending towards the heavens, its peak crowned with a temple comb that once blazed with vibrant stucco and paint. You emerge into a clearing, a grand plaza, vast and surprisingly open. Temples, palaces, and intricate stelae, those upright stone slabs carved with rulers and glyphs, surround you. You can almost hear the echoes, the murmur of a marketplace, the rhythmic chant of priests, the shuffle of sandaled feet. The Maya during their classic period, from around 250 to 900 AD, created these sprawling urban centers, home to tens, sometimes hundreds, of thousands of people. It's a testament to their incredible organization and artistry. You wander, your footsteps hushed on the manicured grass that now covers the ancient plaza floor. You trace the lines of a faded carving on a palace wall, marveling at the skill. Perhaps you see a depiction of a king, resplendent in jaguar pelts and jade, or a scene of cosmic importance. You might even spot a carving depicting a ruler engaged in a bloodletting ritual, sometimes using something as surprisingly intimate as a stingray spine. Ouch. Talk about commitment to the gods. It's a detail that reminds you this wasn't just a pretty postcard location. It was a living, breathing, and sometimes intensely spiritual place. As you take in the sheer scale of this central ceremonial district, the heart of the city, the locus of power, religion, and administration, a curious thought begins to form, like a mist coalescing in the morning air. You look around the grand plaza, at the towering temple of the Great Jaguar, or the elegant palace of Palenque with its distinctive tower. You see the open avenues, the relatively easy access from the surrounding jungle, and you realize what's missing. Where are the walls? Not just little garden walls or decorative barriers. We're talking about massive, imposing, keep the unwanted hordes out defensive fortifications, the kind you'd expect around any self-respecting ancient capital, especially one brimming with wealth, power, and presumably a few disgruntled neighbors. Think of ancient Rome, Constantinople, or even many contemporary Mesoamerican sites like Teotihuacan, which had a more fortified feel in some areas. Here, in the core of these magnificent Mayan cities, there's a distinct openness, an apparent vulnerability that seems almost reckless. It's not that the Maya never built defenses. Some later cities, or those in more contested regions, certainly did have walls or were built in naturally defensible locations. But here, in these classic, iconic centers, the main ceremonial and administrative core often feels startlingly exposed. It's like finding a bank vault with the door wide open and a "Please rob us" sign. Well, maybe not that extreme. But the contrast with other ancient civilizations is striking. This observation, this sense of something absent, where you'd expect it to be profoundly present, is the core of our mystery tonight. It's the puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit the image of powerful, often competing city-states. You stand there, dwarfed by the silent stone sentinels, the jungle pressing in from all sides, and you can't help but wonder why this seeming lack of concern for massive, encircling fortifications around the very heart of their power. Were these Maya rulers just supremely confident in their diplomatic skills, or perhaps their ability to project power outwards, negating the need for inward-facing defenses? Or was their concept of warfare and defense fundamentally different from what we might assume based on Old World models? Did the dense jungle itself act as a kind of deterrent, a natural wall that made formal fortifications less critical? Historians still argue whether the Maya were an inherently peaceful civilization in their early periods, only later succumbing to widespread conflict, or if warfare, perhaps more ritualized or dynastic, was always a part of their world, just expressed differently in their urban planning. The silence of the ruins offers no immediate answers, only more questions that deepen the enigma. The stones keep their secrets close, whispered only to the wind and the persistent roots of the jungle that strive to reclaim them. You feel a shiver, despite the oppressive heat, a sense of profound antiquity, and a puzzle that beckons, a riddle written in stone and swallowed by time. What does this architectural choice, this apparent openness, tell us about the Maya worldview, their society, their understanding of power, and their place in a complex, often turbulent, ancient world? That, my friends, is the question we're going to gently unwrap as we continue our journey. So, you continue your journey, your mind still buzzing from those initial, vivid impressions we just talked about. You approach what you understand to be an ancient city, one of these legendary Mayan centers. Now, what's the first thing that usually springs to mind when you picture an ancient metropolis, especially one from a civilization known for its power and complexity walls, right big ones? You're probably imagining something like the formidable defenses of ancient Rome, or perhaps the almost storybook ramparts of a medieval European castle. You expect to see towering stone structures, maybe a deep, shadowy moat, certainly some very serious-looking gatehouses where guards, who probably haven't had their proper morning cacao yet, would scrutinize anyone daring to approach. You're bracing yourself for that classic imposing silhouette against the sky, a clear, unambiguous statement of, "This is our domain. This is where our power resides, and you, well, you're on the outside." It's the ancient world's version of a very fancy, very pointy, and impressively unjumpable fence. But as you draw closer to one of the great classic period Mayan cities, imagine yourself approaching Tikal, or perhaps the elegant sprawl of Palenque, nestled in its emerald hills. Something feels distinctly different. You squint, your eyes searching for those telltale colossal stone barriers, the kind that scream, "Keep out," or, at the very least, "Toll booth ahead. Buddy, have your jade beads ready." And instead, what do you see? You see the dense, almost overwhelming embrace of the jungle, more jungle, and then, almost seamlessly, almost organically. The city begins to emerge from it. Grand plazas open up, startlingly wide. Pyramids, like man-made mountains, pierce the canopy. Intricate palaces, adorned with stucco and vibrant paint, reveal themselves. But the walls, where are the walls? It's a bit like arriving at a notoriously secure, top-secret government facility and finding they've replaced the 10-foot electrified fences and guard towers with a particularly welcoming row of daisies and a sign saying, "Come on in. The secrets are lovely this time of year." It's initially quite disconcerting. Wouldn't you agree? You can't help but feel a prickle of surprise. Think about the standard playbook for ancient civilizations elsewhere. You've got the Romans. Bless their meticulously organized and often brutal hearts, with structures like Hadrian's Wall snaking across the landscape of Britain. A massive, empire-defining project designed to delineate territory and, shall we say, firmly discourage the northern barbarians, their rather judgmental term. Not minds demande, of course, from popping down for uninvited visits, or journey further back to Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited settlements, a city practically defined in popular imagination by its walls, the very ones that, according to biblical legend, came famously tumbling down. Even earlier, the great Mesopotamian cities like Uruk or Babylon were, in essence, grand fortresses. Their reputations, their very survival, were built as much on the impregnability of their defenses as on the height of their ziggurats or the wisdom of their scribes. These fortifications weren't just architectural whims. They were life or death necessities in a world where your neighbor might very well be plotting to ransack your granaries. Without substantial walls, your average ancient city was basically an open buffet, an all-you-can-pillage invitation for any ambitious warlord passing by. It's like leaving your front door wide open in a rough neighborhood with a neon sign flashing. Free high-value artifacts inside slightly used ceremonial chariots also available. Inquire within. And it wasn't solely about keeping unwanted spear-wielding guests out. Those massive walls served crucial internal functions too. They were instruments of control. They deliberately funneled all movement, all trade, through specific, heavily guarded gates where customs could be collected, tolls exacted, and suspicious characters, well, suspiciously eyed. Walls were also a constant, visible, and often oppressive reminder to the city's own populace of the power and authority of the state, the king, the ruling elite. Every glance towards the city limits reinforced the message, "Look upon my mighty, unscalable walls, ye commoners, and despair." Or, just make sure you pay your tribute on time, and we'll all get along splendidly. There's an undeniable prestige that comes with a well-fortified city. It's a declaration, a status symbol writ large in stone and mortar. The bigger, thicker, and more intimidatingly crenellated your walls, the more important and powerful you appeared to both rivals and allies. It's the ancient world's equivalent of having the tallest skyscraper in the modern city skyline, or owning the most ostentatiously gold-plated sports car. So, let's drift back to our Mayan companions, existing in these seemingly open urban landscapes. You're standing there, perhaps in a vast plaza in the heart of a bustling classic period Mayan center like Petén, the air thick with the scent of incense and cooking fires, the murmur of 1,000 conversations in a language you don't understand, and the sheer openness of it all is almost unsettling. It's like discovering a major national bank that has decided, for aesthetic reasons, to forgo the use of a vault. You'd definitely raise an eyebrow, wouldn't you? Your very first thought might be, are these people incredibly brave, incredibly overconfident, or do they perhaps have some kind of highly effective, yet invisible jungle-based defense system involving squadrons of very angry, highly trained howler monkeys. The apparent vulnerability is what strikes you first and foremost. It makes you want to lean in, perhaps whisper to your imaginary time-traveling companion. Are they quite sure about this whole no big walls approach? Have they met other ancient civilizations? Now, it's a mainstream historical fact that many, if not most, prominent ancient civilizations poured absolutely enormous quantities of resources, labor, materials, time, and treasure into constructing and maintaining defensive structures. The Great Wall of China, for example, wasn't exactly a weekend DIY project. Countless generations toiled and perished in its construction. A truly monumental undertaking, driven by the persistent threat of nomadic incursions from the steppes. This kind of defensive architecture was the norm, the expected. So, the Maya, particularly during their celebrated classic period, which flourished roughly from 250 to 900 AD, really do stand out as an intriguing exception. Of course, like most things in history, it's not quite as black and white as no walls anywhere, ever, full stop. Historians still argue whether A, the general scarcity of massive city-enclosing fortifications in many of the major classic Mayan centers, especially in the southern lowlands, implies a fundamentally different approach to warfare, a unique geopolitical environment, or perhaps defensive strategies that were simply more subtle, more integrated into the landscape, or even more reliant on temporary measures than on permanent, monumental stone curtains. Maybe their walls were, in fact, the incredibly dense, almost impenetrable jungle itself, a natural barrier that would bog down and disorient any invading force. Or perhaps their security lay in complex networks of alliances, or a kind of regional balance of power that made large-scale sieges less common. Or perhaps, and this is always a fun one to ponder, they were just exceptionally good at diplomacy, or, failing that, exceptionally good at hiding when trouble brewed. And here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit for you. While those enormous city-encircling walls, like the legendary Theodosian walls of Constantinople, or the picture-perfect fortifications of Carcassonne in France, were indeed rare for a very long time in the Mayan heartland, it's not the whole story. Some later Mayan cities, particularly those that flourished in the post-classic period after about 900 AD, and especially in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, did build significant defensive walls. The city of Mayapan, for instance, which became a major power in the Yucatan, had a pretty respectable, if somewhat rough and ready, city wall. This development suggests that perhaps circumstances changed over time. Did the neighbors get significantly rowdier? Did the nature of warfare evolve? Did the established political order that perhaps kept a lid on major conflicts during the classic period begin to unravel? Or maybe they just got thoroughly tired of unexpected visitors dropping in unannounced, right in the middle of important sacred ceremonies. You can almost hear the exasperated high priest. Oh, it's you lot again. Yes, the bloodletting ritual is proceeding splendidly. Thank you for asking. No, you can't have any of the ceremonial chocolate this time either. And please, try not to trample the royal macaw. Imagine for a moment the psychological difference it might make. Living in a city without those ever-present, imposing outer walls, it could foster a very different sense of community, a different relationship with the surrounding natural environment, and indeed, with neighboring polities. Perhaps it felt less like being cooped up, less like living in a garrison, and more like being an integral part of a larger, interconnected cosmos. Or, conversely, if you're more of a pessimist, maybe it just meant you learned to sleep with one eye open and kept a very well-sharpened obsidian blade conveniently tucked under your woven reed mat or hammock. As you walk through these wide, open plazas, the complex sounds of the city, the chatter of the marketplace, the rhythmic chanting from a nearby temple, the distant calls of exotic birds from the rainforest canopy, maybe even the occasional, spine-tingling roar of a jaguar, all blend together, unmuted, unbuffered by the dampening effect of a 20-foot-thick stone barrier. It's a profoundly different sensory experience, a very different urban vibe from, say, wandering the streets of ancient Rome, where the looming presence of the Servian Wall, or later the Aurelian Walls, was a constant, solid reminder of us, safely inside, versus them, potentially lurking outside. This apparent vulnerability, this characteristic openness of many classic Mayan cities, is genuinely one of the first things that often puzzles and fascinates anyone new to exploring Mayan archaeology. It directly challenges our deeply ingrained, almost instinctual assumptions about what a city in the ancient world should fundamentally look like, how it should be designed to function, and above all, how it should protect itself. We're so conditioned, culturally and historically, to associate strength, stability, and civilizational success with visible, physical barriers. Could there have been a different kind of strength at play here? Perhaps their true defense lay not in stone and mortar, but in their complex social structures, their profound astronomical and calendrical knowledge, which might have informed strategic decisions, their intimate understanding of the challenging tropical terrain, or, as we touched upon earlier, in carefully constructed and maintained strategic alliances that made large-scale existential attacks less likely or ultimately less effective, or maybe, just maybe, for a significant period during their ascendancy. The early classic Maya simply didn't face the same kind of persistent, city-destroying, existential threats that plagued so many other contemporary civilizations. Perhaps they enjoyed a kind of golden age of relative peace, where the primary focus of communal effort could be directed towards astonishing achievements in art, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, and building really tall pyramids instead of really thick walls. It's a rather nice thought. Anyway, one can always dream of a world where the most significant civic engineering project is a new observatory designed to unlock the secrets of the cosmos, not a bigger, better bunker. So, as you continue to wander these spectral avenues through these cities that seem to breathe with the jungle, that initial sense of surprise, that question of, where are the walls Matyam and lingers? You find yourself instinctively looking for the ramparts, the bastions, the fortified gateways, all those telltale signs of a city girding itself for inevitable trouble. And mostly, you find more temples reaching for the sky, more stelae intricately carved with the dynastic histories of kings and queens, more grand, ceremonial staircases leading to places of profound spiritual significance. It forces you to recalibrate your entire understanding, to start asking a different set of questions, instead of simply asking, how thick are the walls, and how high do they reach? You begin to wonder, with a deepening sense of curiosity, what truly held this remarkable society together? If not massive stone barriers, what was their real underlying source of strength, their enduring resilience? It's a delicious little mystery, isn't it? The case of the city that seemingly forgot its defensive coat, or perhaps, for a good long while, never truly felt the pressing need for one. So, you find yourself wandering through the echoes of ancient landscapes, like we were just doing, perhaps picturing those dense jungles or sprawling river valleys. And as you imagine these early cities, these burgeoning hubs of humanity, a very common feature probably springs to mind: walls. Big ones, small ones, ones that look like they could stop a grumpy badger, and others that could halt an entire army having a very bad day. It begs the question, doesn't it? Why go to all that incredible, backbreaking, resource-draining trouble to build these massive stone embraces around your home? Why build walls anyway? The most obvious answer The one that screams from pretty much every history book and epic movie is protection. Pure and simple. You're living your best ancient life, maybe figuring out pottery or domesticating a particularly stubborn goat. And then, over the horizon, comes trouble. It might be a neighboring group that fancies your goats, or your granaries, or just your general vibe as something they'd like to, well, unvibe. Walls, in this scenario, are your best friend. They are the ultimate keep out summer towing sign. Long before little metal plaques were invented, you can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from within a newly walled city. The sound of chisels and hammers finally falling silent, replaced by the slightly smug feeling of being on the inside looking out. Think of the legendary walls of Constantinople, standing for 1,000 years against siege after siege, a testament to what good engineering and a whole lot of stone can do when you're on everyone's must-conquer list. That's a mainstream historical fact you can take to the bank, or, your next trivia night. These weren't just piles of rocks. They were sophisticated defensive systems, with towers, gates, battlements, and probably a very strict schedule for who had to do guard duty in the rain. But it's not just about stopping pointy things and angry people. Walls are also about control. Once you've got this lovely stone barrier around your city, you suddenly have a very convenient way to manage who comes in and who goes out. And more importantly, what goods come in and go out. Gates become checkpoints, funnels for commerce. Imagine the scene: a long line of merchants, farmers, and travelers, all waiting to pass through the city gate. Here, officials can inspect goods, levy taxes, and generally keep an eye on things. It's like the ancient world's version of customs and immigration, but probably with more donkeys and less confusing paperwork. You want to sell your very fine pottery in our amazing city. Wonderful, that'll be a small contribution to the city's beautification fund, which mostly goes to making the walls even higher. It's a neat system, really. Controlling the flow of trade meant controlling wealth, and controlling wealth, as you know, often means controlling power. So, the walls act as a kind of economic membrane, selectively permeable to things the city desires, and rather impermeable to things it doesn't. It's a bit like trying to get into an exclusive club today. The bouncer at the velvet rope is just a modern, much less stony gatekeeper. And this brings us to the third big reason, one that's a little less about swords and taxes, and a bit more about feelings, symbolism. Oh, the symbolism of a good, sturdy wall. It's a statement, a monumental declaration to the world. We are here. We are strong. We are important. And frankly, we have the resources and the manpower to build this ridiculously large thing, so don't even think about it. You can almost picture a rival king scouting your city from afar, seeing those towering walls and just sighing. Right? He mutters to his second-in-command. Maybe we'll go bother the folks with the charmingly inadequate picket fence instead. The sheer scale of many ancient walls speaks volumes. They were often the largest man-made structures in their respective landscapes, visible for miles. They broadcasted stability, permanence, and the authority of the rulers who commissioned them. Building such a wall wasn't just a practical project. It was a legacy project. It was a way for a king or a council to etch their power into the very stone of the earth. And here's a quirky little tidbit for you sometimes. These walls weren't just plain stone. Some cultures would incorporate sacred stones, or even embed apotropaic objects, things meant to ward off evil, right into the foundations or the gates. Imagine little hidden charms or carvings, a secret layer of magical protection alongside the physical. It's like adding an extra, mystical security system, just in case the tons of rock weren't quite enough. Because you can never be too careful when it comes to existential threats, or perhaps just ensuring your Instagram equivalent, the epic tales told by traveling bards, makes your city sound extra formidable. Of course, the exact balance of these motivations, defense, control, symbolism, is something that keeps academics happily employed. Historians still argue whether the monumental walls of certain Bronze Age cities, for example, were primarily built out of genuine, pressing defensive needs, or if they were more about internal social cohesion and the elite showing off just how many people they could command to haul rocks under a blazing sun. It's probably a bit of both. A messy, human cocktail of fear, ambition, and a desire for a really impressive skyline. It's a bit like today. You might get a fancy security system for your house because you're worried about burglars. But also, let's be honest, because it looks pretty cool and makes the neighbors a tad envious. So, you have these towering defenses, these economic filters, these grand statements of power. You see them across Mesopotamia, around ancient Chinese capitals, girding Roman cities, protecting medieval European towns. It seems like a universal truth. If you're a civilization on the up and up, you build walls. It's just what you do. It's City Building 101, which brings us to a fascinating little wrinkle in the tapestry. A gentle divergence from this seemingly well-trodden path. We've talked about these general reasons, these almost instinctive drives to encircle and protect, to control and to proclaim. But what if a civilization, a very successful, very sophisticated civilization, seemed to look at this checklist and say, interesting, we might have other priorities. What if, when you gaze upon the ruins of their cities, nestled in those jungles we were just imagining, the first thing that strikes you isn't always a colossal, all-encompassing defensive wall. This is where you might start to tilt your head, a little like a curious bird, and wonder about the Maya. If these massive ramparts were so crucial for so long, across so many cultures, why might the Maya, in many cases, and for significant periods of their history, have prioritized differently? What were they pouring their immense skill and labor into, if not always these vast encircling barriers? It makes you pause, doesn't it? It makes you want to lean in a little closer, to sift through the evidence and try to understand their unique perspective on what it meant to build a community, to define a city, and to face the world. What was their recipe for resilience, for power, for identity? If it wasn't always written in towering stone perimeters. So, just as you're settling into that cozy image we painted earlier, the one with those sprawling, seemingly unprotected Mayan cities where everyone just, vibed? Well, let's gently nudge that picture a little. It turns out, not all Mayans were entirely opposed to a good, solid wall. The decision to build, or not to build, seems to have been, shall we say, a very it depends kind of situation. Highly specific to where and when you were trying to, well, not get raided. Take Mayapan, for instance. You wander towards this post-classic powerhouse in the Yucatan, and what do you find? A rather impressive circuit wall, stretching for about 9 kilometers, or a bit over 5.5 miles. It's not exactly the Great Wall of China, mind you. Maybe not even the wall around your cousin's suspiciously fancy gated community, but it was definitely enough to make uninvited guests, or perhaps overly enthusiastic, door-to-door obsidian blade salespeople, think twice. This wall, built of rough, dry-laid limestone, often incorporating existing buildings into its line, enclosed a pretty densely packed city of about 4 square kilometers, housing perhaps 12,000 souls. You can almost feel the close-knit, slightly bustling energy within those confines, the sounds of daily life, grinding corn, children playing, perhaps the murmur of political discussions, all concentrated and amplified by the surrounding stones. It's a stark contrast to the more spread out, almost park-like nature of some of the grander classic period sites we might have touched upon. Remember those? This was the seat of the Kokam lineage, a major political force in the post-classic Yucatan, and it seems they weren't taking too many chances during a period known for its shifting alliances and, let's be honest, occasional unfriendly takeovers. Imagine living there. The sense of security, perhaps. Or maybe a touch of, are we being kept in, or are others being kept out? The wall defined the community in a very real, very physical way. Then you drift over to the coast, to Tulum. Oh, Tulum. You see it perched on those dramatic cliffs, overlooking the most ridiculously turquoise Caribbean Sea. And yes, it has walls. Significant ones, in fact, on 3 sides, protecting its ceremonial heart from any land-based shenanigans, the 4th side. Well, that's a sheer drop to the ocean, a pretty effective natural deterrent, unless your enemies were particularly good at cliff climbing or, possessed surprise naval invasion technology, which, as far as we know, was still in the very early R&D phase. As you stand there, feeling that warm, salty breeze whipping your hair, you can see how these fortifications make perfect sense. Tulum, whose original name, Zama, means City of Dawn, was a thriving port city, a crucial node in the extensive maritime trade routes that hugged the coastline, connecting regions far and wide. Mainstream historical fact, Tulum was one of the last Mayan cities to be built and inhabited, flourishing between the 13th and 15th centuries, a beacon of Mayan culture even as other centers declined. So, with all those valuable goods, honey, salt, cotton, obsidian, jade coming and going, a bit of extra security probably felt like a very prudent investment. Talk about a room with a view and a very clear keep out sign for anyone not arriving by approved sea vessel, canoe pirates presumably being high on the unwelcome list. The contrast of the weathered gray stone of the Castillo against that impossibly blue water, the white sand beaches stretching out below, it's just stunningly picturesque, almost designed for a postcard. If postcards and Mayans had overlapped, you can almost hear the distant calls of merchants haggling in various dialects, the lapping of waves against the canoes pulled up on the beach below the cliffs, the sense of a busy, yet well-guarded, gateway to the Mayan world. Now, let's trek inland, deeper into the Yucatan, to a site that throws another little curveball. Petén? What's special about Petén, you ask, apart from its rather impressive pyramids peeking through the jungle canopy? Well, it's surrounded by a massive ditch, or moat, if you prefer. Yes, a moat. We're talking about a defensive trench, in places nearly 16 feet deep and over 50 feet wide. This wasn't just a casual, please don't step on the grass kind of barrier designed by a passive-aggressive homeowners association. This was serious, a clear statement of intent. Quirky, sheer lesser-known tidbit. The name Petén itself is thought to mean ravine or canyon filled by water in Yucatec Maya, likely a direct nod to this impressive watery feature, though whether it was always filled with water, or perhaps just a very muddy, very deep ditch for much of the year, is another fun little debate for the archaeologists. You can almost smell the damp earth, the rich scent of decaying leaves from the dense jungle pressing in on all sides. Imagine the sheer human effort, the sweat and toil, of digging such a colossal feature using only stone tools and human muscle, and then piling all that excavated limestone rubble and earth to create the substantial ramparts on the inner side, sometimes reaching heights of nearly 23 feet above the surrounding terrain. Crossing one of the 7 causeways that originally spanned the moat would have felt like entering a true stronghold. You wouldn't want to fall into that after a particularly lively festival. Let me tell you, a disorienting tumble into the unknown, even if it wasn't teeming with crocodiles like in the movies. And Petén is particularly interesting because its major defensive features date back to the early Classic period, around 250 AD, or perhaps even the late pre-Classic, which kind of makes you pause and reconsider any simple timeline that says walls came late. So you see, these examples. Mayapan, with its strong enclosing wall creating a tight urban embrace. Tulum, with its dramatic coastal defenses guarding precious trade. Bikan, with its truly formidable moat carved from the very earth. They paint a slightly different, more complex picture than the one of universally wall-free Mayan settlements we might have started with. It really underscores that the decision to fortify, to raise barriers, was deeply woven into the fabric of specific local needs, the shifting political climates, and the very lay of the land they inhabited. Was your city nestled in a hotly contested river valley? Were you a glittering hub of commerce needing to protect your wealth from covetous eyes? Or were your neighbors, shall we say, getting a bit too enthusiastic about expansionist policies? These practical, and sometimes life or death, factors likely tipped the scales towards let's build a wall, or maybe a really big ditch. And this, my friends, leads us to a classic archaeological head-scratcher, one that keeps the experts pleasantly occupied. Historians still argue whether these fortified sites were the anomalies, the outliers, the exceptions that prove the general rule of typically open cities we associate with many classic Maya centers. Or if they represent a more nuanced reality, perhaps an adaptive strategy that became more common in later periods as competition for resources and political power intensified, or if certain regions, due to their unique circumstances, just always had a more, shall we say, robust approach to defining their boundaries and ensuring their security. The evidence, as always, is a fascinating puzzle, with pieces emerging slowly from the jungle soil, leaving plenty of room for us to ponder these ancient choices, these monumental efforts, as we drift through the quiet echoes of their world. So you can imagine, after all that talk of endless stone hauling and the sheer mind-numbing effort of piling rock upon rock, there must have been a few ancient city planners, or perhaps just very fortunate early settlers, who looked around and thought, you know what, I think Mother Nature's got this one covered. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? Trading a lifetime of construction dust for a pre-built defensive system, courtesy of the local geology. And tonight, you and I, we're going to just gently drift through some of these places, where the very land itself rose up, or sank down, or just grew inconveniently to protect its inhabitants. Picture yourself, for a moment, perched high on a sheer cliff. The wind, a constant companion, whispers secrets, or maybe just tries to steal your hat. Below, the world shrinks to a miniature landscape, and any would-be attacker looks rather like an ant, a very determined, angry ant, but an ant nonetheless. Cities like those clinging to the cliffs of the Bandiagara escarpment in Mali, or the breathtaking monasteries of Meteora in Greece, though not cities in the traditional sense, they perfectly illustrate the principle. You don't just stroll on up to these places. Every approach is a climb, exposed and exhausting. The effort of hauling siege equipment up there. You might as well try to mail a battering ram. The defenders above barely need to lift a finger. Gravity becomes their most formidable ally. And a well-aimed rock, or perhaps just a cutting remark about the attacker's fashion sense, could be surprisingly effective. There's a certain smugness that must have come with living in such a place, a kind of "come at me, bro," whispered on the wind. Then, you drift from the dizzying heights down to the water's edge, or rather, out into the water itself. Imagine an island city, a jewel set in a sapphire sea, or perhaps a more murky, protective embrace of a lake or marsh, Venice, of course, floats to mind? A city built on, well, optimism and a whole lot of wooden piles sunk into a lagoon. For centuries, that lagoon was its greatest defense. It's a mainstream historical fact that the shallow, shifting channels of the Venetian lagoon were notoriously difficult for unfamiliar enemy ships to navigate, often leaving them grounded and vulnerable. You see their grand galleons, bristling with intent, suddenly doing an embarrassing belly flop in the mud. Awkward. And it wasn't just about getting stuck. It was about the sheer logistical nightmare of launching an amphibious assault against a city that could control access through those very waters. Remember Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected by causeways that could be easily defended or even destroyed. It's like nature handed them a pre-built moat, complete with complimentary fish for dinner. Of course, not every island city was as serene as Venice might appear on a postcard. Consider ancient Tyre, a Phoenician powerhouse, originally on the mainland. It later expanded to a heavily fortified island just offshore. When Alexander the Great came knocking, he didn't just sigh and walk away. Oh no, he famously built a causeway, a massive land bridge, to reach the island. It took him 7 months. 7. That's dedication. Or perhaps just extreme stubbornness. You can almost hear the Tyrians, initially laughing from their island perch, then slowly getting quieter as the mole crept ever closer. Is he still building that thing? Surely, he'll give up soon. Nope. From islands, let's wade ashore, but not too far. We find ourselves on a peninsula, that geographic feature that's like a cometophobe landmass. Not quite an island, not quite fully part of the mainland. But oh, what a defensive gift it can be. Constantinople, the queen of cities, is the ultimate example. It sat on a triangular peninsula, washed by the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn Inlet to the north, and only needing a truly massive wall, the Theodosian walls we touched upon earlier, on its western, landward side. This strategic position allowed it to control the Bosphorus Strait, the vital waterway between Europe and Asia, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It's like having the only key to the busiest doorway in the world. You can just sit there, sipping your ancient equivalent of a latte, and decide who gets to pass. For over 1,000 years, this natural and man-enhanced position made it one of the most famously impregnable cities in the world. Historians still argue whether its founders fully grasped the immense strategic potential from day one, or if its dominance was a more gradual realization as empires rose and fell around it. Now, let's leave the relatively open vistas of cliffs, islands, and peninsulas and plunge into something a bit more enveloping. Imagine trying to assail a city hidden deep within a dense, steamy jungle, or one surrounded by a seemingly endless, treacherous swamp. The air is thick, alive with the buzz of insects the size of small birds, or so it feels. Every step squelches. Every vine seems to grab at you. This isn't just about a physical barrier, it's about an environmental one. Think of some of the Maya cities, nestled deep in the Petén rainforest of Guatemala, like Tikal or Calakmul. While they did have their own internal structures and sometimes defensive earthworks, the sheer, bewildering density of the jungle itself was a formidable deterrent. You couldn't just march an army through that in neat formations. Your soldiers would be lost, sick, and probably quite demoralized by the constant threat of snakes that look like branches and spiders, that look like dinner plates before they even saw the city, and swamps. Oh, swamps are just nature's way of saying, don't even think about it. They offer poor footing for attackers. Disease is rampant, and moving siege engines. Forget it. You'd spend more time rescuing your trebuchet from a bog monster than actually attacking. There's a rather quirky tidbit about the Nenets people of Siberia, who, while not urban, traditionally used the nearly impassable tundra and swampy summer landscapes to their advantage against encroaching forces. Their enemies, unfamiliar with the terrain, would get hopelessly bogged down. It's a similar principle the land fights for you. You can almost hear the defenders. Oh, you brought cavalry. That's cute. Let's see how they handled the quicksand quarter. In places like these, building massive, continuous stone walls, like those we marvel at elsewhere, might have seemed redundant, or even practically impossible. Why haul stone for miles through a jungle when the jungle itself is doing half the work? Why try to lay foundations in a swamp when the swamp is already swallowing your enemies whole? Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes it's just a really, really inconveniently located piece of real estate. Nature, in its own slow, unyielding way, could be the greatest military architect of all, crafting defenses that no human hand could easily replicate or overcome. And you didn't even have to pay at union rates? Okay, so as you drift deeper into this Mayan world, let's ponder something a little punchier. We've been wandering through these incredible sprawling cities, haven't we? You've seen the monumental architecture, the intricate carvings, and maybe you're picturing epic Hollywood-style sieges, like something out of, well, any movie with a castle, really. Catapults flinging fiery doom, ladders clattering against stone, the whole 9 yards. But what if Mayan warfare wasn't quite like that? What if their approach to conflict was a bit more bespoke? You see, the evidence from archaeology and those ever so chatty hieroglyphs paints a picture of warfare that's, shall we say, less about total annihilation and more about targeted actions. Think less scorched earth and more surgical strike. If you'll forgive the anachronism, it's a fascinating shift in perspective, especially when you remember those seemingly open city cores we talked about earlier. Why wouldn't they all be ringed with colossal, impenetrable walls if war was a constant, brutal affair? Well, let's consider what the goals of Mayan warfare often were. One major objective, as far as we can tell, seems to have been the capture of elites. Imagine you're a king, an ajar, from one city-state, and you're having a bit of a tiff with your neighbor. Instead of mustering a giant army to slowly grind down his entire city, which would be a logistical nightmare involving thousands of people, tons of food, and probably a lot of complaining from the troops. Are we there yet? My obsidian spear is getting heavy. You might opt for a more personal approach, a well-executed raid, perhaps timed for a moment of vulnerability, could result in you nabbing their king, or at least some high-ranking nobles. These captives weren't just unfortunate prisoners of war, they were incredibly valuable. Their capture was a massive status symbol for the victorious ruler. You'd see it broadcast on stelae and temple walls. Look, magnificent jaguar paw of such and such a place. Captured Lord 18 Rabbit of that other place. It was a way to diminish your rival's power and prestige, and quite often, these captured elites faced a rather grim, ritualistic end. We're talking public ceremonies, often involving sacrifice, designed to appease the gods and demonstrate the victor's might. It's a stark reminder that power and religion were deeply intertwined, as we've touched upon before. So, if your primary goal is to snag a VIP, you don't necessarily need to batter down city gates for months on end. A swift, focused incursion might do the trick. This brings us to another aspect: resource raiding. Sometimes, the aim wasn't about capturing people at all, but about grabbing valuable goods. Think jade, cacao, which was like their currency, and, let's be honest, way better than carrying around heavy coins, exotic feathers for those fabulous headdresses, or even skilled artisans. Again, a large, slow-moving siege army isn't ideal for a smash and grab. Smaller, more agile forces could sweep in, cause a bit of chaos, take what they came for, and then melt back into the jungle before the defenders could fully mobilize a massive response. It's like the ancient equivalent of a Black Friday sale, but with more spears and significantly less friendly customer service. Then there's the element of ritual conflict. Historians still argue whether some Mayan battles were almost entirely symbolic, more like pre-arranged, highly ritualized encounters than all-out brawls for territory. Imagine something akin to a deadly serious, divinely sanctioned sporting event, where the outcome had profound religious and political implications. The Star War events, for instance, often mentioned in inscriptions, seem to have been linked to specific astronomical conjunctions, particularly involving Venus. These weren't just random skirmishes. They were cosmic events played out on the earthly stage. The mainstream historical fact here is that many inscriptions explicitly link these Star Wars to the capture and sacrifice of enemy rulers, reinforcing that elite capture was a key component. This ritualistic aspect could also explain the focus on individual prowess and the elaborate warrior costumes. You're not just a soldier, you're a participant in a sacred drama. Your regalia, your weapons, your very actions are imbued with meaning. It's a far cry from an anonymous soldier in a vast legion. Now, this isn't to say that large-scale battles never happened, or that cities were never sacked. We have evidence of fortifications at some sites, particularly later in the Classic period, or in more contested frontier zones, and there are depictions of battles that look pretty intense. But the prevailing style, the one that seems to shape much of their intercity relations, might have leaned more towards these targeted actions. Think about the implications for city planning. If you're not constantly anticipating a massive, months-long siege where an enemy army tries to starve you out or undermine your walls, then maybe those gigantic, all-encompassing defensive structures become less of a priority, especially around the sacred core. Perhaps the natural defenses of the terrain, like those we saw at some sites nestled in hills or surrounded by swamps, combined with a well-trained, quick reaction force, were deemed sufficient for the kind of warfare they most often practiced. It's a bit like having a really good alarm system and a guard dog instead of building a personal fortress in a relatively safe neighborhood. Overkill for the likely threat. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that some interpretations of Mayan ballgame imagery suggest that the game itself could sometimes be a substitute for warfare, or perhaps a ritualized precursor or reenactment of it, with the losing team or captain potentially facing sacrifice. Talk about high-stakes sports. Imagine if the Super Bowl ended that way. Ratings would be through the roof, I suppose, but HR would have a field day. So, you see, the nature of Mayan warfare wasn't necessarily a constant, grinding affair of massive armies clashing and cities being besieged in the way we might imagine from European history. It was often more nuanced, more focused, perhaps even more theatrical in a deadly serious way. The emphasis on capturing elites for ritual purposes, raiding for specific resources, and the potential for highly symbolic Star Wars meant that warfare could be incredibly impactful without always requiring the total destruction of an enemy's urban center. This, in turn, could influence why some of those magnificent city cores, which we've been mentally walking through, seem so relatively open. It's not that they weren't defended, but the style of defense might have been tailored to the style of attack they most commonly faced. It's a delicate dance of strategy, ritual, and resource management, all played out under the watchful eyes of their gods and the dense canopy of the jungle. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many whispered plans for raids and captures echoed through these very plazas you're now imagining? Right. So you've got these absolutely monumental stone walls we were just looking at. These grand statements of, don't even think about it. But walls, as magnificent as they are, aren't the only trick up a city's defensive sleeve. Sometimes, the most effective defenses are the ones you don't see coming, or the ones that are, shall we say, a bit more organic. You begin to notice that beyond the immediate shadow of the main fortifications, the land itself seems to be part of the plan. First up, let's talk about moats. Ah, the classic. You approach a defended place, and there it is, a great yawning ditch, sometimes filled with water, sometimes ominously dry. If it's a wet moat, you can almost smell the stagnant, murky water, a cocktail of algae, decaying leaves, and who knows what else. It's not exactly an inviting swimming pool, is it? More like a very effective nope zone. Attackers would have to bridge it under fire, or try to fill it in, both rather slow. Exposed processes. Dry moats, on the other hand, are essentially deep pits, designed to break the momentum of a charge, make siege tower placement a nightmare, and generally cause attackers to stumble and fall in a most unheroic fashion. Keeping a moat, especially a wet one, in good condition was a constant task. Imagine the medieval equivalent of pool cleaning, but instead of chlorine, you're dealing with, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to lose your car keys in there. The sheer variety of things dredged from historical modes, from weapons to everyday objects, tells a story of centuries of oops moments. Then you have palisades. Picture these as the more rustic, down-to-earth cousins of stone walls. Essentially, they're sturdy fences made of sharpened wooden stakes, driven deep into the ground, often interwoven with branches. You might see these ringing, less critical areas, perhaps an outer bailey or a newer, less fortified suburb. They wouldn't stop a determined siege engine for long, not like those colossal stone barriers, but they're surprisingly good at deterring casual raids, slowing down an initial assault, and making it very difficult for cavalry to just sweep in. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of mallets driving stakes, the splintering sound of wood being shaped. A well-maintained palisade, perhaps with a thorny hedge encouraged to grow through it, could be a real pain for anyone trying to get through in a hurry. It probably wouldn't stop a highly motivated squirrel with a vendetta against civic order. But then again, few things truly can. Palisades were also much quicker and cheaper to erect than stone walls, making them a practical choice for expanding settlements or as temporary measures. Now, let your eyes scan the wider landscape. You start to see subtler, yet incredibly effective, defenses in the form of earthworks. These are banks, ditches, ramparts, all sculpted from the earth itself. It's like the defenders decided to give Mother Nature a little nudge in the direction of strategic landscaping. You might encounter a series of undulating mounds and trenches, forcing any attacking force to break formation, to climb and descend, exposing them to missile fire from above. These aren't just random bumps in the terrain. They're carefully planned to channel attackers into kill zones, to protect vulnerable approaches, or to create elevated platforms for defenders. The Romans, for instance, were absolute masters of the temporary marching camp, throwing up impressive earthwork defenses almost every night while on campaign. It's a testament to how effective simple dirt and ditches can be when intelligently deployed. Some earthworks were even planted with specific types of thorny bushes, not just for stability, but to add an extra layer of, please don't try to climb this, to the whole affair. And it's not just about what's immediately around the city. You might notice strategically placed outlying structures, that distant watchtower perched on a hill. It's not just for enjoying the scenic, pre-industrial countryside. It's an early warning system, a tripwire, a fortified mill by a river crossing, a small fort guarding a key pass, even a seemingly innocent monastery built like a minor castle. These can all serve to delay an enemy, to harass their supply lines, or to provide intelligence. They act as forward observation posts and strong points, forcing an attacker to either bypass them and risk attacks from the rear, or to spend precious time and resources reducing them one by one. Each one is a small, stubborn obstacle. Sometimes, the best defense isn't man-made at all. It's the sheer, unadulterated difficulty of the surrounding landscape. Imagine trying to haul heavy siege engines, supplies, and thousands of grumpy soldiers through a dense, trackless forest, or across a treacherous marsh where the ground tries to swallow your boots with every step. Or, what about a city nestled in a mountain valley, accessible only through a few narrow, easily defended passes? You see how the natural terrain can be a formidable ally. Rivers can act as giant moats, cliffs as impassable walls, and dense woods as confusing, ambush-filled mazes. The effort required to even reach some settlements could significantly weaken an attacking force before a single arrow was loosed. You can almost feel the exhaustion, the frustration of an army struggling against the land itself, their grand invasion plans slowly sinking into the mud. Finally, we arrive at the city itself, and this is where things get really interesting and a little contentious. You wander through these ancient streets, and they're often not the weaved, straight boulevards we might be used to. Instead, you find yourself navigating a labyrinth of narrow, twisting alleyways, sudden dead ends, and oddly angled junctions. It's almost as if they were designed to get you utterly lost. And that, some believe this was precisely the point. Historians still argue whether city layouts themselves had inherent defensive functions, or if they just sort of happened that way due to organic growth, property lines, and the medieval equivalent of, it seemed like a good idea at the time. The theory goes that such a layout would be a nightmare for an invading force unfamiliar with the territory. Attackers, once they breached the outer walls, could be easily confused, ambushed, and funneled into kill zones. A small group of defenders, knowing every nook and cranny, could hold off a much larger force by using the urban environment to their advantage. Think about it. You're an invader. You finally bashed your way through a gate. You charge in, and you're in a tiny square with 5 different, equally unpromising alleyways leading off it. Meanwhile, people are shooting at you from windows and rooftops. You think trying to navigate IKEA on a busy Saturday is confusing. Try finding the citadel in a medieval city with an army at your back and arrows whizzing past your ears. You'd probably stumble into 3 bakeries and a suspiciously quiet cul-de-sac before you found what you were looking for. Some cities even appear to have had specific features like fighting platforms incorporated into their street designs, or houses built with easily defensible ground floors. It's a fascinating idea that the very bones of the city could be its last line of defense, turning the urban fabric into a weapon. These invisible defenses, from the humble ditch to the confusing street, all played their part, complementing those more obvious stone behemoths we so often focus on. All right, so you're standing there, perhaps in what would have been the planning office of a Mayan ruler, probably just a slightly less humid room with a bigger stone chair, and you're looking at the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet, though it's more likely a series of knotted strings, or perhaps just a very, very stressed out royal advisor pacing back and forth. The question on everyone's lips, or at least the one whispered nervously, is walls are we sure about walls? Because, let's be honest, building a significant defensive wall, the kind we were pondering earlier, isn't like putting up a garden fence. You're not just popping down to the ancient Mayan equivalent of Home Depot for a few posts and some pre-treated lumber. No. This is an undertaking of monumental proportions. Imagine the sheer, back-breaking labor, quarrying stone, huge limestone blocks, sometimes weighing tons. You see teams of workers, their muscles straining, sweat pouring down their faces in the tropical heat. Slowly, painstakingly, chipping away at the Earth's bones. Then, how do you move these behemoths? No beasts of burden, remember. No wheeled carts for heavy transport. It's all human power. People dragging, people rolling, people levering these stones, inch by agonizing inch, across uneven terrain. It's a logistical nightmare just thinking about it. And they probably didn't have project management software, unless you count a very stern foreman with a pointy stick. And the resources. Oh, the resources. It's not just the stone. It's the lime for mortar, a truly intensive process involving burning limestone for days to create quicklime, then slaking it. This requires vast amounts of firewood, leading to deforestation if not managed carefully. Think of the water needed, the food to sustain thousands of laborers diverted from other tasks. It's a colossal drain on the city-state's treasury, its manpower, its natural environment. You can almost feel the collective groan of the populace when the decree comes down. More wall. It's like your modern city council announcing another massive, disruptive infrastructure project that'll take years and go wildly over budget, except with more loincloths and a higher chance of jaguar encounters. So, you, as the astute ruler, or maybe just someone who really doesn't fancy hauling another 10-ton block today, start to wonder what else could we do with all this energy, all this wealth, all these people? Is a wall truly the best bang for our jade buck? Consider for a moment the allure of a magnificent new temple. You picture it rising, platform by platform, towards the heavens. A vibrant splash of red and white stucco against the emerald green of the jungle. Imagine the intricate carvings, the larger-than-life masks of the gods glaring down. This isn't just about piety, though that's a part of it. A grand temple is a statement. It tells your neighbors, we are favored by the cosmos. Our gods are powerful, and so are we. It's a focal point for the community, a place for rituals that, hopefully keep the rain coming and the maize growing. Priests, astronomers, mathematicians, many of them congregated in these temple complexes. The Maya, as a mainstream historical fact, developed an incredibly complex calendar system, tracking celestial movements with astounding accuracy. And much of this knowledge was tied to religious practice and temple observatories. Investing in a temple is investing in cosmic order, in scientific advancement as they understood it, and in a very visible symbol of your reign's legitimacy and power. It's PR, divine addition, or perhaps your royal behind is feeling a little uncushioned. Maybe a new palace is in order. You envision sprawling courtyards, cool, shaded rooms with intricate murals depicting your glorious and probably slightly exaggerated victories. Think of the administrative power it projects. This is where decisions are made, where tribute is received, where emissaries from other cities are entertained, or perhaps subtly intimidated. A grander palace means more space for scribes, for artisans, for the bureaucracy that keeps a complex society humming. It's a tangible representation of the state's authority. And let's be real, a bit of comfort after a long day of ruling wouldn't go amiss. It's like upgrading from a shared dorm room to a penthouse. Same job, much nicer view. Then there are the causeways, the Sac-Ub-E, those brilliant white roads. You see them stretching out from your city center, straight as an arrow, paved with crushed limestone that would have gleamed in the moonlight. These weren't just for a casual evening stroll. They connected important ceremonial centers within a city, or even linked entire cities across miles of often difficult terrain. Imagine the ease of movement for trade caravans, for armies if it came to that, for pilgrims traveling to sacred sites. They facilitated communication, integration, and control. Some of these Sac-Biab were massive engineering feats in themselves, raised several feet above the surrounding land. They were the ancient Mayan interstates, minus the toll booths and terrible service station coffee. But perhaps the most compelling alternative, the one that speaks to the very foundation of your society, is agricultural infrastructure. Your population is growing, and everyone needs to eat. Walls don't fill bellies, not directly anyway. So, you could invest that same labor, those same resources, into expanding your agricultural output. You see teams constructing intricate terrace systems on hillsides, transforming steep slopes into productive farmland, preventing erosion, and conserving water. Picture them digging canals for irrigation, bringing life-giving water to dry fields, or, even more ingeniously, creating raised fields in swampy, seasonally flooded areas. This lesser-known tidbit is fascinating. The Maya built these elevated platforms of soil, surrounded by canals, which were incredibly fertile due to the muck dredged from the canals and the constant water supply. It was a highly sustainable system, almost like a pre-Columbian form of intensive aquaculture agriculture. More food means a healthier, larger, and potentially happier population. A well-fed populace can support more artisans, more priests, more warriors, more everything. It's the bedrock of your civilization's strength and resilience. So, the choice is stark. Do you invest in defenses, in reaction to perceived threats? Or do you invest in projects that actively build prosperity, project power through grandeur, or ensure the fundamental well-being of your people? Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for constructing grand ceremonial centers, for instance, was purely religious devotion or a more calculated display of political power and resource control, a way to keep the populace focused and employed. It's a complex calculation, a delicate balancing act. Each choice has profound implications. Building a wall might make you feel safer for a while, but if your people are starving, or if your gods seem displeased because their temples are crumbling, that wall might not be enough to protect you from troubles brewing within. It's the ultimate ancient budgeting dilemma: swords or plowshares, or in this case, fortifications or pyramids and raised fields. And the answer, as always, probably depended very much on who was whispering in your royal ear and how loud the rumbles were from beyond your currently non-existent city walls. You approach the very heart of this ancient city, the place where all the important-looking avenues, like those we just meandered down, seem to converge. And as you get closer, you start to get this feeling. It's not quite the everyone pile in. The barbarians are at the gate. Vibe you might expect from a city center. Remember those massive, almost ostentatious walls we saw way back at the city limits? They seemed designed to keep everyone out, or perhaps everyone in. But here, in the core, things feel different, almost intentionally vulnerable in a strange way. The air itself seems to hum with a different energy. The structures are grander, yes, more ornate than the residential blocks we peeked into earlier, but they also feel less lived in the everyday, feet up on the couch sense. Think of it like the difference between your comfy, slightly messy living room and, say, the grand hall of a major museum. You could technically camp out in the museum, I suppose, if you didn't mind security judging your choice of pajamas. But it's clearly not for that. This central precinct feels more like that, a place of significance, perhaps even profound sacredness, designed for specific, important functions rather than just day-to-day existence for the masses. Many ancient civilizations, like the Maya with their sprawling ceremonial centers, such as Tikal, or even ancient Rome with its Forum, dedicated these vast central areas primarily to religious rites, public administration, and displays of power, rather than dense housing for the general populace. These weren't just places for gods and bureaucrats, though they certainly catered to them. They were powerful symbols of civic identity, cosmic order and the very structure of their society. So, seeing this pattern of a specialized core here isn't entirely out of left field. It's a well-trodden path in human urban development. Now, you might be thinking, okay, sacred space, administrative hub, I get it. But what about when things go south? When the alarm bells ring, or the ancient equivalent of a text alert saying duck and cover goes out? Where does everyone run? And that's where things get a bit peculiar, and where our hypothesis starts to take shape, unlike those fortress cities we've all seen in epic movies, where the king bellows to the keep and everyone, from the lowliest turnip farmer to the fanciest noble, scarpers behind a final, super thick wall. This core doesn't quite offer that kind of universal sanctuary. The avenues leading out from this central plaza are wide, almost conspicuously so, suggesting quick dispersal rather than a huddled, desperate defense. It's almost as if it was designed to be emptied out efficiently, not to become a last stand for the entire population. Perhaps the real treasure here wasn't the collective citizenry, but the rituals themselves, the accumulated knowledge stored in some long-lost archive, the sacred objects, or the continuity of leadership and priestly functions that these buildings housed. This is where you encounter one of those delightful scholarly debates. Historians still argue whether these core areas in many ancient cities were primarily ritualistic and administrative centers, perhaps with a small elite residential component, or if they also supported a more significant permanent population. Was it a bustling downtown by day and a quieter, more exclusive zone by night? Or were there always lights on in the palace windows, indicating a more populous heart? The jury, as they say, is still out, probably having a very polite, very academic disagreement over some incredibly dusty pottery shards and foundation layouts. So, if it's not a public bomb shelter, who is protecting this hallowed, or at least very important, ground? Look closely at the remaining foundations near what appears to be the main temple-like structure, or perhaps a palace. You can discern the outlines of barrack-style layouts, but they're on a smaller, more refined scale than what you'd expect for a general army encampment. This hints at a dedicated, perhaps highly trained, elite guard. Not a vast citizen militia drawn from every neighborhood, but a select group sworn to protect the sanctity of the core. Or maybe just the big cheese who officiated the important rituals and signed all the decrees. Think less of a sprawling National Guard and more of a really serious group of museum security for the crown jewels, but with pointier sticks and, presumably, a much sterner dress code. Their primary job, then, wouldn't have been to save everyone in the city, but to secure this specific place, or the important people and items within it, ensuring the continuity of whatever made this a city this city. It's a bit like how in some ancient Egyptian temples, access was increasingly restricted the deeper you went into the complex. The general public might only be allowed into the outer courts, while only the highest-ranking priests and the pharaoh themselves could enter the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies. This city core could have operated on a similar principle of layered access and importance, a sacred or vital zone, not meant for the hoi polloi to just wander into, especially not during a crisis. Perhaps the evacuation plan was simply key personnel, this way to the designated safe zone or escape route. Everyone else, well, you remember those big outer walls, right? Head towards those and try not to scuff the ceremonial plaza on your way out. It sounds a bit callous, a bit doorman at a very exclusive celestial nightclub. But from a strategic standpoint of preserving the core functions or symbols of a state, it's a grim sort of efficiency. Imagine the sheer resources poured into this central zone, the finest stonework you've encountered on our journey, the most intricate carvings, the most impressive architectural feats. They're all concentrated here. If this was just another neighborhood, or even the main defensive stronghold for all, you'd expect that level of craftsmanship to be more evenly distributed, or at least for the defensive structures themselves to be the most imposing features. But here, the grandest constructions seem to be these temples, palaces, what might be observatories for tracking the heavens, or expansive administrative halls. These are places for pronouncements, for divine communion, for tracking the agricultural calendar through celestial observation, or for engaging in some really high-stakes ancient paperwork and record-keeping. The very layout, those wide processional ways we noted earlier, speaks to parades, grand ceremonies, and public displays of power or piety, not to narrow, easily defensible streets designed for house-to-house fighting. It's built for spectacle, for awe, not necessarily for a prolonged siege involving the entire populace. It's like designing a magnificent wedding venue with fantastic acoustics for the vows and a glorious dance floor, but completely forgetting to install a panic room for when Uncle Barry starts his notoriously off-key karaoke performance. Priorities. You know, the show must go on, or at least, the most important parts of it must be preserved. You can almost hear the faint echoes of rhythmic chanting carried on the breeze, smell the lingering ghost of incense that once perfumed the air, see the rustle of elaborate garments as processions moved through these spaces. It's a stage, a grand, open-air theater for the most important dramas of this civilization. Their connection to the cosmos, their societal order, their very identity. And like any theater, when the show's over, or when a fire alarm or, you know, an invading horde with notably less appreciation for the dramatic art sounds, the primary goal is to get the key players and the irreplaceable props off stage quickly and safely. The audience, well, they bought the tickets, they experienced the spectacle. A bit harsh, perhaps, but it's one compelling way to interpret the design choices you're seeing all around you. The noticeable lack of extensive food storage facilities within this immediate core, unlike what you might find in a besieged castle's keep designed to sustain thousands, also points away from it being a long-term refuge for the many. Any supplies readily available here would likely be for the priests, the rulers, the administrators, the essential personnel. Everyone else, presumably, had their own neighborhood stockpiles, or were expected to, well, not be in this exclusive zone when the metaphorical trumpets of doom sounded. This hypothesis, that the core served a purpose far removed from being a communal bunker, makes you reconsider the entire city's design philosophy. The outer defenses, those impressive walls we talked about, were for the state, for the territory, for the general idea of us. But this inner sanctum, this was for the essence, the spiritual and political heart of their world, kept beating by a select few and designed to be protected by an elite force, or, if necessary, to have its vital components spirited away, rather than forming the last line of a desperate, all-inclusive defense. It's a subtle but profound shift in how you might view the priorities of the people who built and inhabited this ancient metropolis. They weren't just building a place to live. They were crafting a statement, a sacred machine, and perhaps a beautifully orchestrated, if somewhat exclusive, escape route for its most vital components. And as you trace the lines of those intricate murals we were just looking at, noticing the subtle shifts in artistic style over the centuries, you begin to wonder if everything else changed so much too. It's a good question, because just like their art and, well, their favorite reality star dynasties, the Maya approach to keeping unwanted guests out wasn't exactly static over their incredibly long history. You don't just stick with the same old "Beware of the Jaguar" sign for 1,000 years, do you? Especially when your neighbors start getting a bit ambitious. So, let's drift back, way back to the earlier days. the pre-classic and the dawn of the classic period. You might imagine these idyllic, peaceful villages, everyone sharing cocoa and astronomical observations. And for a while, perhaps defenses were, shall we say, more optimistic. Think about it. In the very early stages, when settlements are smaller, maybe further apart, the need for massive, imposing fortifications might not be top of the to-do list. Perhaps a well-placed lookout, some natural defenses like a river or a steep hill, or even just a sturdy wooden palisade, basically the ancient equivalent of a really good hedge, would do the trick. Early fortifications might have been more about marking territory and a bit of wishful thinking, like putting up a no trespassing. Violators will be gently chided sign. However, as Maya society grew, as cities swelled, and like we talked about with those shifting alliances, political jockeying became the sport of kings. The vibe started to change. You can almost feel that subtle tension creeping into the air, can't you? Like the quiet before a tropical downpour. During the classic period, especially as you move into its later stages, you start to see a distinct uptick in, well, unneighborly behavior. This wasn't just a sudden switch. It was a gradual realization that maybe, just maybe, that really good hedge wasn't going to cut it against a determined war party looking to snag some tribute or a few high-status captives. A mainstream historical fact that you'll often hear is that the late classic period, say from around 600 to 900 AD, saw a significant increase in warfare and political instability across the Maya lowlands. This wasn't just a few isolated skirmishes. We're talking about more intense, more frequent conflicts. And when people start fighting more, they naturally start thinking more about how not to lose. It's human nature, really. So, you begin to see cities strategically choosing their locations with defense in mind. Perched on hilltops, like we saw with some of those ceremonial centers, wasn't just for the views. It made it a real pain for attackers to schlep uphill while dodging whatever the defenders were gleefully rolling down at them. You see the construction of moats. Yes, actual moats, though probably less fairy tale castle and more muddy mosquito-infested deterrent. Imagine trying to explain that to your ancient Maya HOA. Ramparts, earthworks, and more substantial stone walls begin to appear, encircling not just the ceremonial core, but sometimes larger residential areas too. It's like upgrading from a simple door lock to a full-blown security system, complete with laser grids, or, you know, sharpened stakes. Now, this trend really comes into its own when you look at what happens as the classic period wanes and you drift into the mists of the terminal classic and then the post-classic period, roughly from 900 AD onwards. This is when you encounter the really famous examples of walled cities. Think of places like Tulum, perched dramatically on those seaside cliffs, its walls facing inland, or Mayapan in the Yucatan, which became a major political center and was thoroughly encircled by a formidable stone wall. A pretty clear statement that they weren't messing around. Beacon, even earlier in the late classic, famously boasted a massive ditch and rampart system. These weren't just token gestures. These were serious investments in security. Why the walls then? Well, it correlates pretty neatly with what we understand about these later periods. Political fragmentation was a big one. Remember how those big superstar city-states of the classic period started to lose their bling? As power decentralized, you had more smaller polities, all vying for resources, for trade routes, for bragging rights. This often meant more conflict, a kind of constant, low-humming tension that occasionally flared into open warfare. Building a wall was a very visible way of saying, "We're here, we're strong, and please take your raiding party elsewhere." Thank you very much. No, it's like putting up a massive "Do Not Disturb" sign on your entire city. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. Some of these fortifications might not have been purely defensive in the military sense. Archaeologists sometimes find that walls or ditches also served to demarcate sacred or elite spaces within a site, or even to control the flow of people and goods for economic or ritual purposes, not just to repel spear-chucking invaders. So, a wall could be both a shield and a status symbol, or even a tool for urban planning. Multifunctional, like a good Swiss Army knife. And of course, the reasons for this upsurge in fortifications are still mulled over by sleepy academics in dusty libraries. Historians still argue whether the increased fortification in the post-classic was primarily a direct result of escalating internal Maya conflicts, a sort of escalating family feud on a grand scale, or if it was more a response to external pressures, like migrations of other groups into the Maya area, bringing new forms of warfare, or just general instability. It's probably a bit of both, a complicated cocktail of factors, as these things usually are. Kind of like arguing whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Strong opinions, lots of debate, and the truth is, probably deliciously complex. What you can definitely see as you let your mind wander through these changing landscapes is that Maya defensive strategies were incredibly adaptive. They weren't stuck in the past. They assessed the threats, they looked at their resources, and they built what they needed, from simple palisades that might deter a casual raiding party to massive stone walls designed to withstand more organized sieges. Their defenses tell a story. They're a stony, earthy chronicle of the times, reflecting the anxieties, the conflicts, and the resilience of a people navigating a changing world. Even the best walls, though, probably couldn't keep out determined gossip. Some things are just unstoppable, but a good wall could, at least, give you a fighting chance against more tangible threats, letting you sleep a little sounder behind its protective embrace. All right, so you've journeyed with me through landscapes where walls were, well, pretty much non-negotiable for staying alive. Remember how we've seen cities build higher, thicker, more elaborate defenses as if their very existence depended on it. Because, you know, it often did. But now, let's drift into a place that seems to throw a rather large, jungle-covered wrench into that neat little narrative. We find ourselves in the heart of the Maya world, at the legendary city of Tikal. As you step out from the dense Petén rainforest, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms, the first thing that hits you isn't a towering defensive wall. No, it's the sheer jaw-dropping scale of the place. Giant pyramids, like Temple 1 and Temple 2, pierce the jungle canopy, facing each other across a vast great plaza. These aren't just buildings, they're stone mountains, meticulously crafted, reaching for the sky gods. You can almost feel the residual energy of the tens of thousands who lived and worshipped here. Estimates for Tikal's peak population, including its sprawling peripheries, range dramatically. But we're talking about a significant urban center, perhaps housing 60,000 to 90,000 people. Maybe even more if you count everyone in the wider controlled region. Imagine the bustling markets, the ceremonial processions, the daily life unfolding in the shadow of these colossal structures. It's like stumbling into an ancient Manhattan, but with more jaguars and, surprisingly, fewer obvious barricades around its core. You walk through these causeways, these sac-bio-ab, paved white roads that connect the major complexes, and you notice something, or rather, the lack of something. Where are the massive, encircling walls around this vibrant civic and ceremonial heart? You're looking at one of the most powerful cities in the classic Maya world, a political heavyweight, and its core, where the elite lived and the most sacred rituals took place, feels remarkably open. It's like they built these incredible temples, these intricate palaces, and then just sort of forgot the front door, or perhaps more accurately, they had a different concept of what a front door for a city of this magnitude should be. You get the feeling they were so busy one-upping each other with pyramid height that a simple wall felt a bit beneath them. Or maybe they just ran out of strong guys to carry the stones after building Temple Fort. Now, don't let this apparent openness fool you into thinking Tikal was some kind of peaceful, kumbaya-singing jungle retreat. Oh no. The historical record, painstakingly pieced together from all those intricate hieroglyphs on stelae and lintels, tells a very different story. Tikal was a major player in a politically charged landscape, and that meant conflict. It's a mainstream historical fact that Tikal had a long and bitter rivalry with the city-state of Calakmul, often referred to as the Snake Kingdom. This wasn't just a friendly sports rivalry. We're talking major military campaigns, captured kings, and periods of dominance and subjugation. There are depictions of warriors, of captives, of events that clearly spell out, we fought, and sometimes we lost, sometimes we won. So, the city faced very real threats. This deepens the mystery, doesn't it? A rich, powerful city, frequently at war, yet its glittering core seems to invite you right in for a cup of, well, whatever potent beverage they were brewing. The plot, like a good jungle vine, thickens, while the immediate ceremonial core of Tikal, with its acropolis and great plaza, lacks those classic storybook city walls. That doesn't mean Tikal was entirely without defenses. Archaeologists have found extensive earthworks, ditches, and embankments, sometimes quite substantial, much further out from this central zone. Think of them less as a tight girdle around the city's waist, and more like a very, very wide belt, kilometers out in some cases, often incorporating or cutting across the natural landscape of bajos, or seasonal swamps, and ridges. These weren't necessarily unbroken lines, but a series of strategically placed defensive features. Some of these earthworks were likely topped with wooden palisades, creating formidable barriers for anyone trying to march an army through the dense terrain. It's a different defensive philosophy, not fortifying the heart in an obvious, imposing way, but rather creating a broader, more dispersed defensive network. The layout of Tikal itself also hints at defensive thinking, even without a perimeter wall around the core. Those sac biab, the raised causeways, weren't just for looking grand or keeping your sandals clean during the rainy season. They channeled movement. In times of trouble, they could have been controlled, monitored, perhaps even barricaded at key points, turning them into defensive corridors or kill zones. The very elevation of the central complexes, often built on modified hills, provided a natural advantage, offering better lines of sight over the surrounding landscape. And here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit about Tikal's layout that ties into defense. The sheer density and complexity of the structures within the central areas could have been a defensive feature in itself. Imagine you're an attacker, not familiar with the city's winding paths, plazas opening into other plazas, courtyards leading to dead ends, and towering buildings creating a disorienting maze. Even today, with signposts and tour guides, you can get wonderfully lost in Tikal's sprawling heart. Imagine an invading army trying to navigate it without Google Maps, probably tripping over tree roots and bumping into stelae, all while howler monkeys provide a less than helpful soundtrack. This architectural density could break up attacking formations, confuse them, and allow defenders familiar with the terrain to launch ambushes or stage tactical retreats. Of course, the exact nature and purpose of all these features are still debated. Historians still argue whether Tikal's extensive system of outer earthworks and Baju's seasonal swamps were primarily defensive barriers, sophisticated water management systems, agricultural boundaries, or, more likely, some clever combination. of all three. It's rarely a simple either-or with ancient civilizations. They were masters of multitasking with their monumental constructions, building a defensive ditch that also helps manage water for agriculture. That's just smart resource management. You can almost picture the ancient Maya TripAdvisor reviews: stunning views from the North Acropolis, 5 stars. Just a heads up, the central plaza is a bit drafty and occasionally prone to surprise enemy visits. Pack a spear. Tikal then presents us with a fascinating case of a city that clearly understood warfare, engaged in it frequently, yet chose a defensive strategy that prioritized the protection of its wider domain and perhaps relied on the intimidating scale and complexity of its core, rather than a single, easily identifiable wall. It makes you wonder what other subtle defensive layers are still hidden beneath the jungle floor, or in the very way the city was designed to be experienced. So, after all that talk about strategic retreats, and those rather, shall we say, enthusiastic siege tactics we just explored, you might be wondering about a place that really leaned into the whole "let's build a giant wall and hope for the best" strategy. And for that, we find ourselves drifting through the Yucatan Peninsula, a little later in the Maya timeline, towards a city that wore its defenses like a rather chunky stone necklace, Mayapan. Imagine, if you will, stepping out of the dense Yucatecan scrub, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the buzz of unseen insects. You've been journeying, perhaps from one of those sprawling, open, classic period cities we talked about earlier, like Tikal or Palenque. Remember those cities that seem to say, "Our power is so self-evident, walls are merely decorative"? Well, Mayapan hums a very different tune. As you approach, the first thing that really commands your attention isn't a towering pyramid, though it has those too, but a rather formidable stone wall. This isn't just any wall. It's Mayapan's defining feature. It's a ring, encircling the city for about 9 kilometers, or roughly 5.5 miles if you're metrically challenged, like some of us after a long day. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from the masons who finally finished it. You run your hand along the rough limestone blocks, surprisingly well fitted in most places, though it's clear this was built for function over elegant aesthetics. It stands, even now in its weathered state, about 2 to 3 meters high. That's roughly 6 to 10 feet. Not exactly the Great Wall of China, perhaps, but certainly enough to make an uninvited guest think twice, especially if they forgot their grappling hook at home. You'd notice it's not just a single boring line of stone. There are gateways, strategically placed, probably numbering around 7 to 12, depending on which archaeologist's map you're currently squinting at. These weren't grand, triumphal arches. Mind you, more like narrow, easily defensible passages. Think less, "Welcome to fabulous Mayapan Soamati," and more, "State your business," and make it snappy. Some of these gateways even had features like baffled entrances, forcing any attackers to expose their flanks as they tried to navigate the turns. Clever, right? Almost like they'd played a few tower defense games in their spare time. Now, why the sudden urge to play Fortress in the post-classic period, which is roughly from 900 AD to the early 1500s? Well, the political landscape had, shall we say, become a tad more competitive. Remember those grand, often autonomous city-states of the classic period? The post-classic Yucatan saw a shift towards a more centralized, though perhaps shakier, political structure. Mayapan itself rose to prominence after the decline of Chichen Itza, becoming the dominant political and cultural capital. It was the seat of the Kokam lineage, who, according to some historical accounts, weren't exactly winning any most popular rulers awards. They maintained their power through a confederation, often a delicate balancing act of alliances and, well, let's just say, firm encouragement of loyalty. This kind of political setup, where you have a dominant power trying to keep a bunch of somewhat resentful regional lords in line, often breeds a certain defensiveness. It's like being the unpopular kid at school who suddenly inherits a lot of candy. You might want to build a little fort around your locker. The wall, therefore, wasn't just about fending off distant, unknown enemies. It was very likely also a statement to those within its sphere of influence. A clear message from the Kokam rulers. We're in charge here, and we're well protected. Thank you very much. Contrast this directly with those earlier, wall-less wonders. Tikal, for instance, in its heyday, sprawled outwards, its ceremonial core open, its influence projected by might and prestige rather than stone barriers. Palenque, nestled in its hills, relied on its natural defenses and the aura of its divine kingship. These cities, in their prime, perhaps felt less of a need for such overt, all-encompassing fortifications. Their security might have been perceived to lie more in their political reach, their alliances, and the sheer scale of their populations and resources, rather than a continuous and stone embrace. Mayapan, on the other hand, feels more compact, more anxious. Its estimated $12,000 to 17,000 inhabitants were crammed within these walls. A stark difference to the more dispersed populations around some classic centers. One mainstream historical fact about Mayapan is that it was the last great Maya capital in the Yucatan before the Spanish arrival. Flourishing from about the 1220s to the 1440s, its fall was reportedly quite dramatic, involving a revolt by the Shu lineage against the Kokam rulers. So much for that wall keeping everyone in line. Now, for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit. Within Mayapan's walls, archaeologists have found an incredible density of residential structures, over 4,000 of them, suggesting a very urbanized, if somewhat crowded, lifestyle. But here's the fun part. Many of these houses had their own small household shrines and altars, often miniature versions of the larger temple pyramids. It's like everyone had their own tiny sacred space, a personal connection to the cosmos, right in their backyard, amidst the hustle and bustle of a fortified city. Almost like those tiny desk Zen gardens people have now, but with more, actual deities. The construction of the wall itself is interesting. It's not a solid, impenetrable barrier in all sections. Some parts are more robust than others, and it seems to incorporate natural features like cenotes, those amazing sinkholes we've talked about. Remember, within its perimeter, which would have been vital for water. You can imagine the city planners poring over the landscape, deciding where the wall would offer the most protection while also enclosing these crucial resources. It's a very practical approach to urban defense. You might also notice watchtowers, or at least structures that could have served as such, integrated into the wall. From these vantage points, sentinels would have scanned the flat, scrubby horizon, looking for any signs of trouble, perhaps a rival faction with a bone to pick, or maybe just a particularly aggressive flock of wild turkeys. One can only imagine the boredom punctuated by moments of sheer panic. The wall enclosed not just homes and ceremonial buildings like the prominent Castillo, which is a smaller imitation of Chichen Itza's famous pyramid, but also agricultural plots and those all-important cenotes. This made Mayapan a self-contained unit to a certain degree, capable of withstanding a siege for a period by having resources within its defended perimeter. It's a bit like those all-inclusive resorts, but with more spear throwing and less poolside bingo. But here's the rub, and it's a big one for scholars. Historians still argue whether Mayapan's walls were truly effective as a military deterrent. On one hand, they clearly demarcated the city, controlled access, and would have presented a significant obstacle to any direct assault. Imagine trying to scale that thing under a hail of projectiles. Not a fun Tuesday afternoon. On the other hand, the historical accounts of Mayapan's eventual downfall suggest that the walls were breached or circumvented when the internal political structure fractured. A wall is only as strong as the unity of the people defending it from within. Right? If there's enough internal strife, even the best walls can become, well, just a pile of rocks. Some scholars suggest the wall was as much symbolic as practical, a powerful visual statement of Kokam authority and the city's distinct identity in a more fragmented post-classic world. It screamed, "This is Mayapan, and we do things differently here." It's a bit like a teenager dyeing their hair bright green. It's a statement, even if it doesn't actually make them better at, say, math. So, as you stand there, tracing the lines of this ancient boundary, you can feel the echoes of that different era. The post-classic period in the Yucatan was a time of shifting alliances, of new powers emerging, and of a general sense of, well, needing a good wall. It was a pragmatic response to a changing world, a world where the old certainties of the classic period had faded, replaced by a more volatile, and perhaps more overtly militaristic, political game. Mayapan's Ring of Stone is a testament to that shift, a silent, circular guardian that tells a story of power, anxiety, and the enduring human desire to feel safe, even if safety is just a well-built wall away from a potentially unhappy neighbor. You can almost hear the distant sounds of the city within the murmur of thousands of voices, the chipping of tools, the rituals at those countless household shrines. All of it, cocooned within this stony embrace. It makes you wonder what it was truly like to live with that constant, visible reminder of potential external threats, and perhaps internal tensions too. A bit like living next to a really noisy highway. Eventually, you might tune it out, but it's always there. Isn't it? A low hum of "what if" at the edge of your perception. And as the sun begins to dip lower, casting long shadows from the remnants of the wall, you ponder the fate of cities and their defenses. Mayapan's ring, ultimately, didn't save it from internal collapse, but it certainly defined it for centuries. It stands as a powerful case study, a real shift from the open grandeur of earlier times to a more fortified reality. So, while you might picture every Mayan city-state hunkered down behind those formidable stone ramparts we've talked about, or perhaps, like we saw in some areas, surprisingly open to the jungle, there's another layer of defense, a more, shall we say, talkative one. You're now drifting into the intricate, sometimes downright gossipy, world of Mayan diplomacy, alliances, and tribute, a realm where a well-placed word or a strategically offered bundle of quetzal feathers could be worth more than 1,000 sharpened spears. Imagine, if you will, the air thick with the scent of copal incense, the humid breeze barely stirring the elaborate feathered headdresses of envoys. You see them, these ancient diplomats, journeying sometimes for weeks through dense jungle paths, riverways teeming with, well, things that bite. They aren't just carrying messages, they're carrying the weight of their city-state's future. Their arrival at a neighboring, or perhaps rival court, is a performance in itself. There are protocols, speeches laden with flowery metaphors that would make a modern politician blush, and the careful exchange of gifts. It wasn't just a fruit basket. Mind you, we're talking about precious jade, intricately woven textiles, spondylus shells from distant coasts, and, of course, cacao. The beans that were, quite literally, money and a highly prized drink. A poor gift could be an insult, an overly lavish one might signal desperation. It was a delicate dance, a bit like trying to assemble flat-pack furniture with only vague hieroglyphic instructions. Frustrating, complex, and with a high chance of everything collapsing if you make one wrong move. These diplomatic missions weren't just for show. They were the lifeblood of intercity relations, laying the groundwork for alliances. And oh, the alliances the Maya could weave. You find these powerful city-states, like Tikal and Calakmul, locked in their famous centuries-long rivalry, a kind of Mayan Cold War, if you like, complete with proxy skirmishes and spheres of influence. To bolster their positions, they'd form extensive networks. It's a well-documented historical fact that the Kanul dynasty, the Snake Kings of Calakmul, masterfully built a vast web of allied and subservient cities to encircle and challenge the might of Tikal. This wasn't just a handshake agreement. Alliances were often sealed with royal marriages. Picture a princess from Palenque journeying to Petén, not just for a change of scenery, but to bind two powerful lineages together. It's like an ancient version of a corporate merger, but with more elaborate ceremonies and probably better food. These ties could mean shared trade routes, mutual defense pacts. You scratch my back, I won't let their obsidian-toothed clubs scratch yours, and a combined front against larger threats. Now, not all relationships were equal. You have the concept of vassalage. Imagine you're the ruler of a smaller, ambitious city-state. You look at the colossal pyramids of a powerhouse like Yaxchilan or Piedras Negra. You hear the distant roar of their jaguar warriors in your dreams, and you think, you know what? Maybe sending them a yearly care package of our finest pottery and a few skilled artisans isn't such a bad idea. This is vassalage, a hierarchical system where a lesser Ajah, or lord, acknowledges the suzerainty of a more powerful one. It wasn't always a forced subjugation, though sometimes it certainly followed a rather persuasive military demonstration. Sometimes it was a strategic move for the smaller state, offering them protection from other predators in exchange for loyalty and, crucially, tribute. The overlord, in turn, gained resources, manpower, and an extended buffer zone. It's a bit like paying for a really comprehensive security system, where the security company also expects you to send them your best chocolate and help them fight their battles. And that brings us to tribute, the lifeblood of these power dynamics. You see, tribute wasn't just about economic extraction. It was a public acknowledgement of status. Carved stone monuments, those stelae we've imagined tracing with our fingers, often depict rulers receiving tribute from humbled vassals. Bundles of cloth, strings of jade beads, containers brimming with cacao, even captives from lesser skirmishes, sometimes destined for rather unpleasant public ceremonies. It's how the big players flexed. The sheer logistics of moving these goods, sometimes hundreds of miles through challenging terrain, without wheeled vehicles or beasts of burden, remember, is staggering. Imagine the long lines of porters, sweating under the tropical sun, carrying immense loads. They didn't have interjungle express delivery with tracking numbers, so ensuring these precious goods arrived safely and on time was a feat in itself. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Some archaeological interpretations suggest the existence of arrival houses or specific structures within Mayan cities designed to formally receive and perhaps temporarily store these tribute goods and house the dignitaries bringing them. It points to a highly organized system, not just a casual drop-off. So, how does all this intricate web of diplomacy, these carefully constructed alliances, and these often burdensome tribute systems connect back to those stone walls? Or the puzzling lack of them in certain places during specific times? Well, you can begin to see how these political relationships themselves could function as a form of security. If you're a city-state like Karakol, and you've managed to forge strong alliances with several powerful neighbors, or you're part of Tikal's sphere of influence during one of its dominant periods, the immediate need for massive, mile-high fortifications around your ceremonial core might lessen. Why? Because an attack on you could trigger a response from your much bigger, scarier friends. It's the ancient equivalent of mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. During periods of relative political stability, when the major powers had reached a sort of equilibrium, or one bloc was clearly dominant, these networks could, in theory, deter opportunistic raids or full-scale invasions on core, well-connected areas. The walls, mes amont, were, in a sense, political and social, extending far beyond the city limits. Your first line of defense wasn't necessarily a pile of rocks and sharpened stakes. It was your relationship with the Ajaw 3 valleys over, sealed with his marriage to your cousin and his annual shipment of exquisite macaw feathers. Of course, this stability was often fragile. Historians still argue whether these Mayan political structures, particularly the larger hegemonies, represented true centralized empires in the Roman or Incan sense, or if they were more like constellations of influence, constantly shifting as alliances broke, new powers rose, and old loyalties frayed. When these diplomatic ties shattered, when a powerful ally suddenly decided they liked your neighbor's tribute better, or when a charismatic new leader decided to shake up the geopolitical chessboard, that's when you'd probably start wishing you'd invested more in those stonemasons and less in, say, gold-plated jaguars for the palace. The political landscape was as dynamic and sometimes as treacherous as the jungle itself. A strong alliance could mean generations of peace and prosperity for your city, allowing resources to be channeled into art, astronomy, and those magnificent pyramids we so admire. But a diplomatic blunder, a broken treaty, or the death of a key allied ruler could plunge a region into conflict, making those sturdy walls suddenly look like a very, very good idea again. So, you see, the security of a Mayan city wasn't just about its physical defenses. It was deeply entwined with the ever-shifting, ever-fascinating currents of its political relationships. It's like today. Really, sometimes a good treaty is better than a good fence, but it never hurts to have both, just in case your neighbor decides they really want your prize-winning avocados. So, we've spent a good bit of time wandering through ancient settlements, haven't we? Poking around imaginary foundations, wondering about those grand walls, or the distinct lack thereof. But what happens when the walls aren't telling the whole story? Or when they're simply not there to whisper their secrets? You find yourself looking for other, sometimes more subtle, sometimes brutally obvious, clues that things weren't always peace and quiet in these ancient landscapes. Archaeology, you see, is a bit like being a detective with a very, very cold case, and the witnesses are, well, dust and stones. Imagine you're carefully brushing away layers of earth, and suddenly, the soil under your trowel changes. It's darker, almost black, full of charcoal flecks and fragments of what looks like vitrified mud brick. You've hit a destruction layer. Burned buildings are one of the most visceral pieces of evidence for conflict. You can almost smell the ancient smoke, feel the phantom heat. These aren't just accidental fires, not when they're widespread across a settlement, often associated with a sudden abandonment. The telltale signs are the collapsed roofs, scorched pottery still in place, as if dropped mid-use, the sad, twisted remains of wooden beams. It's a snapshot of chaos, frozen in time. Sometimes, you might even find remnants of the everyday abruptly ended. A weaver's loom, weights scattered amidst the ash, or a collection of cooking pots crushed as a burning roof caved in. It's archaeology's way of shouting, something terrible happened here. It's not quite as dramatic as a Hollywood explosion, more like finding a perfectly preserved Pompeii, only with more fire and fewer, intact vacation villas. Then, there are the grimmer discoveries, mass graves. These are not your neatly arranged cemeteries with individual burials and thoughtful grave goods. No, these are hurried, often disorderly pits filled with multiple individuals, sometimes showing signs of violent trauma on their bones, a perifracture on an ulna, a projectile point embedded in a rib, a skull with a gaping hole that wasn't from a particularly aggressive woodpecker. When you find these, especially near a settlement that also shows signs of burning, the picture of conflict becomes starkly clear. It speaks of a desperate end, of a population overwhelmed. You can almost hear the silence that followed. It's a sobering reminder that for all our romantic notions of the past, it could be a brutal, unforgiving place. Mainstream historical fact for you: the Crow Creek Massacre site in South Dakota, dating to the 14th century, reveals a devastating event where at least 486 individuals, men, women, and children, were killed and buried in a mass grave, their remains showing clear evidence of violence and mutilation, likely during an attack on their village. It's a chilling testament to the scale of pre-Columbian warfare in some regions. Beyond the immediate aftermath of destruction, you might stumble upon weapon caches. These are fascinating. Imagine a collection of spearheads, arrowheads, swords, or axes, all found together, sometimes hidden away in a pit or under a floor, or even thrown into a well. Are these the armory of a besieged town, hastily concealed before the final attack? Or perhaps they're a ritual offering, a symbolic decommissioning of weapons after a successful campaign or a peace treaty. Sometimes they're just beautifully made, unused, suggesting they were more for display or status than for hacking your neighbor into tiny pieces. The context is everything. A pile of bronze spearheads buried near a city gate screams defense, while a single, exquisitely crafted dagger in a chieftain's tomb might whisper prestige. It's like finding a modern-day survivalist's bunker versus finding a decorative sword collection. One says the end is nigh. The other says, I have too much disposable income and a thing for pointy objects. And, of course, sometimes the ancients left us written accounts, or at least pictorial ones, glyphic inscriptions, like the famous Mayan stelae or Egyptian temple reliefs, often depict battles, captives, and triumphant rulers. You see them, carved in stone. These ancient narratives: a king stands tall, trampling his enemies, while scribes dutifully record the number of slain foes or captured towns. These are invaluable because they give us names, dates, and sometimes even the stated reasons for the conflict. Though you always have to take them with a pinch of salt. Propaganda is hardly a modern invention. Remember how we talked about rulers wanting to look good? Well, their version of an Instagram filter often involved exaggerating victories and conveniently omitting any embarrassing defeats. So, while these glyphs and reliefs tell us that warfare happened and who was involved according to the victors, they're not always the most objective news reports. This brings us to one of the biggest challenges, the limitations of the archaeological record, especially when it comes to absence. What if you dig and dig, and you find no massive walls, no widespread burn layers, no obvious weapon caches, no battlefield graves? Does that automatically mean this was a peaceful paradise, a utopian society that had transcended conflict? Not necessarily. This is where archaeology gets really tricky. The absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Perhaps their defenses were made of wood and earth, long since decayed, leaving only subtle traces that are incredibly hard to detect or interpret. Maybe their conflicts were smaller scale, more like raids than sieges, leaving fewer dramatic signatures. Or perhaps their primary mode of defense wasn't static fortification, but diplomacy, alliances, or even just being so remote and unappealing that nobody bothered to attack them. It's like trying to prove a negative. It's incredibly difficult. You can't just say, well, No walls. Guess they were all hippies. That's not quite how it works, as much as we might wish for such simple answers. And this ties directly into the even greater challenge interpreting ancient intent. We can uncover what people did. They built this structure, they buried these objects, they discarded these bones. But why they did it? That's the million sestertii question. That weapon hoard we mentioned, was it hidden in fear, offered in piety, or just forgotten storage? That seemingly peaceful village without walls, was it truly peaceful, or just very good at hiding its anxieties or resolving conflicts before they escalated to wall-building levels? Historians still argue whether certain ritual deposits of weapons were truly about religious belief or a more pragmatic way of taking them out of circulation to enforce peace. We look at patterns, we compare sites, we draw on ethnographic analogies very carefully because cultures are wonderfully, maddeningly diverse. But ultimately, peering into the minds of people who lived thousands of years ago is a humbling and sometimes frustrating endeavor. A quirky tidbit for you, some early archaeologists, when finding single isolated tools or weapons, would sometimes interpret them as votive offerings if they couldn't immediately explain them. It became a bit of a running joke. Can't figure it out, must be ritual? Sometimes, though, a dropped spear is just a dropped spear. Knowing the difference across millennia, that's the art. So, when we try to understand conflict, defense, and even peace in the ancient world, we're piecing together a mosaic from scattered, often ambiguous tiles. The story archaeology tells us is rich, fascinating, but always incomplete. Always open to new interpretations as we find new pieces or look at old ones with fresh eyes. It keeps us searching, keeps us questioning, which is, perhaps, the most important part of the journey. So, here we are, at the end of our winding path, or perhaps just a pause in a much longer, more complex journey through time. You're standing, metaphorically, amidst a clearing, the jungle canopy. High above, dappled sunlight filtering down onto the scattered stones of a Mayan ruin, some walled, some defiantly open. We've spent a good while now, haven't we? Poking at the why behind those massive stone ramparts, or their conspicuous absence. And if you were hoping for a neat, tidy, one-size-fits-all answer, well, you probably haven't been paying attention to how history, especially ancient history, tends to operate. It's rarely a simple A plus B or wall. You see, trying to pin down the exact reason a particular Mayan city decided to build walls, or why its neighbor just a few leagues away didn't, is like trying to assemble a colossal jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half have been chewed on by a very enthusiastic jaguar. What we're left with is a picture that's fascinatingly incomplete, but one where we can start to see the shapes emerging. Remember when we talked about the lay of the land? That sheer, unadulterated geography. Some cities, like the almost legendary Tikal with its natural ravines and bajos, had geography doing half the defensive work for them, building a wall on top of a steep escarpment. That's just smart. Efficient. Like putting your IKEA bookshelf against a wall instead of in the middle of the room hoping for the best. Others, sprawled out on flatter plains, might have felt a bit more exposed, like that one friend who never locks their car. You just know it's going to end badly. So, for them, a man-made barrier was less a choice and more a necessity if they wanted to sleep soundly. And then there's the ever-shifting, ever-dramatic nature of Mayan warfare. We've touched upon how it wasn't always the same game. Early on, warfare often seemed more, shall we say, performative, focused on capturing high-status individuals for ritual purposes, rather than raising entire cities. In that context, perhaps a massive wall felt like overkill, like bringing a tank to a very serious game of tag. But as political landscapes changed, as rivalries intensified, especially during the late Classic period, warfare styles seem to have evolved. Remember those accounts of more destructive campaigns, the sieges, the attempts to truly conquer and dominate. Suddenly, a good, solid wall starts looking like a very attractive investment. It's like the difference between a schoolyard scuffle and an all-out zombie apocalypse. Your defensive needs change rather dramatically. Speaking of investments, let's not forget the political and economic calculus involved. Building a monumental wall system isn't something you do on a whim over a long weekend with a few buddies and some lukewarm chocoha. It requires immense resources, stone, labor, engineering know-how, and, crucially, a political structure capable of organizing and commanding that labor. A powerful Ajah, a king with significant centralized authority, might be able to rally the populace and the resources for such a grand project. Think of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Not built by committees, were they? So, the presence of walls could be an indicator of a certain type of political organization, a strong hand on the tiller. Conversely, a more decentralized polity, or one with its resources tied up in, say, elaborate temple constructions or extensive trade networks, might have made different choices. They might have opted for alliances, diplomacy, or just hoping for the best, a strategy that sometimes works until it spectacularly doesn't. And then there's the specific role of the urban core itself. What, was the city center for? Was it primarily a sacred precinct, a place for rituals and ceremonies, with the bulk of the population living in more dispersed agricultural settlements? If so, walling off just the ceremonial heart, as we see in some places, makes a certain kind of sense. It's protecting the symbolic and spiritual core, the identity of the polity. But if the city was a densely packed urban environment, a true population center, then the walls would serve a more direct protective function for the people themselves. Historians still argue whether the primary function of many Mayan city walls was to protect the entire populace during a siege, or to secure the elite and ceremonial centers, leaving the common folk in the surrounding areas to fend for themselves. It's a rather grim thought, but one we have to consider. It's also interesting how the economic choices play into this. Imagine a city heavily invested in long-distance trade, its wealth flowing from jade, obsidian, or cacao. Protecting those trade routes and the stored wealth within the city might be paramount. Walls become a vault. But what if a city's economy was primarily agricultural, with vast farmlands spreading out from a less concentrated core? Walling off the entire agricultural production area would be impractical, if not impossible. So, their defensive strategies might have focused more on mobile defense, or fortifying smaller, strategic points. One rather mainstream historical fact is that the classic Maya period, roughly 250 to 900 AD, saw incredible urban development, with cities boasting populations that rivaled, and sometimes exceeded, contemporary European cities. Places like Tikal or Calakmul were massive, complex urban sprawls, and understanding their defenses requires us to think on that scale. It wasn't just a fort, it was protecting a way of life, a whole ecosystem of people, power and belief, and for a quirky, lesser-known tidbit. Consider the site of Petén in Campeche, Mexico. Beacon is famous for its massive ditch and rampart system, dating back to the early Classic, or even late pre-Classic. What's particularly interesting is that this defensive system seems to have been built before many of the major monumental structures within the site, suggesting that defense was a foundational concern from very early on, not an afterthought. Some even suggest the ditch was so substantial it might have been partially filled with water, creating a sort of Maya moat, though that's still up for debate. Imagine trying to storm that after a long march through the jungle, probably already regretting not packing enough bug spray. So, you see, it's not one single thread we're pulling on, but a whole tapestry. It's the unique blend of the local geography, those hills and swamps we mapped out in our minds. It's the current flavor of warfare. Was it a polite, ritualistic, "Excuse me, may I capture your king?" or a more brutal, "We're here to burn it all down"? It's the strength and style of the political leadership. Could the Ajah actually make everyone build that wall? Or was he too busy commissioning another very large stone face of himself? It's the economic priorities. Are we investing in stone ramparts or fancier macaw feathers for the upcoming festival? And finally, it's about what that city was. A sacred ceremonial hub, a bustling trade emporium, or a concentrated population center. Each city, each polity, faced its own unique set of circumstances, its own pressures, its own opportunities. They weighed the costs and benefits, likely with a great deal of debate, political maneuvering, and perhaps even a few prophecies thrown in for good measure. There was no Maya wall-building handbook, no standardized checklist. It was a dynamic response to an ever-changing world. And that, perhaps, is the most profound takeaway. The mystery isn't a failure on our part to find the answer. The mystery is the answer. The complexity, the variability, the sheer human element of decision-making in the face of uncertainty. That's what makes the Maya, and indeed all ancient civilizations, so endlessly captivating. We're piecing together a story from echoes and shadows, and the picture that emerges is one of incredible ingenuity, adaptation, and, yes, a healthy dose of things we simply don't, and perhaps never will, fully understand. The stones may be silent, but the questions they provoke continue to resonate, urging us to keep digging, keep thinking, keep imagining what it was like to stand on those ramparts, or to live in a city that chose a different path. The puzzle pieces we have, the archaeology, the epigraphy, the environmental data, they all hint at this intricate dance. It's like trying to understand why some people today live in gated communities and others live in open neighborhoods. There's a whole spectrum of reasons, from perceived safety to economic status to simple personal preference, all tangled together. The Maya were no different, just with more jaguars and, arguably, better pyramids. So, as we stand here, the sounds of the imagined jungle around us, the weight of centuries pressing down, it's clear that the story of Mayan walls is far from over. New discoveries are made all the time. New interpretations shift our understanding. What seems like a solid theory today might be reevaluated tomorrow with the unearthing of a new inscription or a more detailed survey of a forgotten settlement. The debate continues, the research presses on, and the mystery, in many ways, deepens and enriches our appreciation for these incredible people. The unanswered questions are, in themselves, a kind of monument to the complexity we're still striving to comprehend. And so, our journey through the mists of time, exploring these ancient stones and the stories they whisper, gently comes to a close for tonight. The hypothetical fire we've been gathered around is now just softly glowing embers, casting long, peaceful shadows. You can almost feel the cool night air of the Petén settling around you, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures lulling you into a state of quiet contemplation. The questions about walls, about choices, about the rise and fall of these magnificent cities, they will linger, of course, like the scent of copal incense on a still evening. But for now, let those thoughts drift. Let the complexities soften. Allow yourself to just be, carried away by the gentle currents of wonder and the profound, enduring mystery of it all. sleep well, and dream of ancient places. Shh.